In her TED Talk, Sheryl Wu Dunn made a case for why gender inequality should be considered one of the greatest injustices of our time, and outlined how addressing gender inequality would help to solve many of the fundamental challenges faced by the developing world. Let's think about this in greater detail. As we've done before, though, it's important to lay out a few foundational concepts before proceeding. While we often use the terms sex and gender interchangeably in everyday speech, there are important differences. Sex refers to the biological or physiological characteristics that define men and women. Gender, on the other hand, refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for men and women. Masculine and feminine are gender categories. Male and female are sex categories. The roles created and enforced through socialization, often from a very early age. In the United States, we encourage girls to like pink, to wear dresses, and play with dolls. Boys are encouraged to play with toy cars and soldiers, to build forts, and to climb trees. Girls are cheerleaders, boys play football. In doing so, they're socialized into gender roles at a very young age. Children who stray from traditional gender roles are pushed to conform. A little boy who wears pink to kindergarten quickly learns that pink is a girl's color. Usually, though, the development and enforcement of gender roles is more subtle. As a result, people often come to think of these divisions as natural. But in spite of their socially constructed nature, gender differences are often essentialized. In 2005, Lawrence Summers, yes, the same Lawrence Summers who wrote that World Bank memo about pollution we referenced before, was the president of Harvard University. In a speech before a conference on diversifying the science and engineering workforce, hosted by the National Bureau for Economic Research, Summers offered his take on the problem. He suggested there were two reasons for the shortage of women in science and engineering posts. First, he said, quote, "The largest phenomenon by far is the general clash between people's legitimate family desires and employers' current desires for high power, high intensity." Summers was suggesting, in other words, that women are reluctant to work long hours necessary to be a successful academic because they have childcare responsibilities. Second, he argued that there are, quote, "issues of intrinsic aptitude and particularly the variability of aptitude." Boys, in other words, were genetically predisposed to perform at higher levels in math and science, particularly at the most advanced levels, according to Summers. This is a prime example of gender essentialism. Finally, he concluded that the two factors might be, quote, "reinforced by what are in fact lesser factors involving socialization and continuing discrimination." But regardless of the way we attempt to paint gender differences as natural or essential, gender is neither. Nor is gender a simple binary of male versus female, masculine versus feminine. Rather, both sex and gender exist on a continuum. On one end are characteristics we associate with masculinity: assertiveness, decisiveness, strong, rational. On the other end are the characteristics we usually associate with femininity: passivity, weakness, emotion. This division is usually referred to as the gender binary. And as with most binaries, on one side, in this case the masculine, is usually privileged over the other. In the context of development, this plays out in several important ways. You'll recall from our previous discussion in the first week of class that gross domestic product excludes unpaid labor and economic activities that do not take place through the formal economy. We noted at that time the result of these exclusions in terms of the developing countries is that GDP tends to understate the actual size of the economy. But additionally, a feminist analysis highlights the gendered implications of this way of thinking about the economy. GDP frames our understanding of the nature of work by including and excluding particular elements. In using GDP, we're making choices, whether we formally acknowledge it or not, about what kind of work counts and what kinds don't. By defining economically valuable work as paid work that takes place through the formal sector, we're devaluing the productive and subsistence work performed disproportionately by women in both the developed and developing world. A few recent examples from the World Bank's 2012 development report in this graph highlights the phenomenon. Through a time-use survey, the World Bank observes that men in countries around the world spend more time in market activities and less time in housework and childcare than women. This figure from the report notes that countries like Iraq and Guatemala Women perform 80% of the childcare and housework, while men perform about 75% of the paid market work. Even in the United States, women perform a disproportionate share of the household reproduction. And this is true whether we're working in the formal, and this is true even when women are working in the formal sector. Indeed, as this graph from the 2012 World Development Report notes, women often bear a double burden, working one shift at a paid job in the formal sector and a second equivalent shift in the unpaid job of maintaining the household. Interestingly, the World Bank's report observes that women often feel this double burden even when they are responsible for bringing home all of the household income. The hours spent by women in maintaining the household, in other words, usually come at the expense of leisure time or for time for health or education, not in lieu of participation in the formal labor market. The calculation of GDP and the double burden faced by women tends to invisibilize the central role of women's labor in the process of social reproduction. That is, their labor tends not only to be devalued, but obscured from the viewpoint of planners and theorists. Social reproduction, and particularly the central role of women in that process, fades into the background and is thus taken for granted. Practically, we see this play out in numerous ways. Even in countries with relative gender equality, male agricultural extension workers who promote rural economic development in the global south deal primarily with men, not women, in their activities. Land tenure and credit are available to men, but not women. And when families face limited budgets, it's the girls who are first removed from school or first go without food. Yet we know that women are the key to successful economic and social development. Even setting aside the normative argument that gender equality is an important goal for its own sake, we know that there's a practical importance to gender equality. As we've previously noted, educating girls is probably the single most important developmental activity a country can undertake. It provides immediate return on investment in the form of a more educated workforce. Numerous studies have shown that income controlled by women is more likely to be spent on children's education and clothing, or on food and health care for the household. Money controlled by men, by contrast, is more likely to be spent on alcohol and entertainment. But across the developing world, women are less likely to have paid employment, and when they do, they likely earn less as well. Further, developing countries which educate girls and boys at more equal rates have slower population growth rates as educated women tend to marry later in life and have fewer children. As the graph here shows, the relationship between the total fertility rate of a country and the average years of schooling for women of reproductive age from 1970 to 2009. African countries in both charts are noted in blue, Asia is red, the Americas are yellow, and Europe is orange. As this clip shows, the number of years girls spend in school increases, the total fertility rate declines. And we can see this in motion over time. Similarly, in this graph, we see female literacy rates versus the total fertility rate. Again, as you can see, as female literacy rates increase, the total fertility rate declines. In both cases, there's a direct correlation. And as women's equal participation in public life is also associated with better and more transparent governance. As this graph suggests, where women play a more active role in public life, the level of corruption is lower. This tendency holds even when we control for national income, civil liberties, education, and the nature of legal institutions. Similarly, women who own their own businesses are less likely to pay bribes. This holds true even when controlling for the character of the firm, such as its economic sector or size, and the characteristics of the manager, such as level of education. Finally, we also know that economic growth and gender equality are positively correlated. In the long run, income growth promotes gender equality by increasing women's education, investment in girls' human development, and women's rates of participation in the labor force. That provides you with a broad overview of why gender equality is important in the context of development. In the next lesson, we'll explore how gender equality has been incorporated into development in practice.